writer or tourist guide is no less a theorist than a professor in Paris or New York. It's part memoir, part literary criticism, part art criticism, part travel journal, and part essay. It's a hybrid form that I think it's fair to say you've invented for the creation of this wide-ranging book. Is the idea of genre, the idea that a piece of writing should stick to its lane, has that ever mattered to you?
It hasn't, Jeet. I mean, I'll take this opportunity to thank you for your support for my first book, and I bring it up not as a plug, but because it is relevant to the question you asked.
Again, an unclassifiable book, a hybrid book.
I wasn't conscious. I'm never conscious. I don't think anyone is. You've written across forms, and I think the idea, an image, all of this comes to us at a particular moment in our lives, not operating through us intentionally, as in, I'm going to start writing a novel tomorrow. The idea works through us in language until it finds a form. And sometimes the form changes life midway. In How I Became a Tree, which would later come to be seen as a book about the plant humanities or difficult words or categories like that, important and self-important categories like that. I didn't set out to write any such book. I was writing about, basically, it was a book of surviving. I was trying to negotiate, come out of a difficult time in my emotional life, and was looking for forms of life that would allow me to live outside the social human. So gravitating towards trees, towards the plant world and plant life, trying to discover an ancestry, a community of people, both living and dead, across communities, across literary histories and linguistic cultures. Writing that book, and we know that every book is different from the other, but writing that book allowed me to see something in myself that I wasn't really interested in my own life. That was uninteresting to me. I was interested, that was only a kind of starting point of investigation to see whether I was really as alone in the world as I thought I was, or as I think I am. So looking for people, looking for an ancestry always, in literature, in art, in people around me, always looking for a neighborhood. So I think the idea of genre, and one of my favorite writers is Michel Serres. And in this book, he's not as well known as Derrida. I mentioned him once in this book. They went to college together in Paris. In this book called The Five Senses, he says that at any given point of time, all the five senses work in us simultaneously. For instance, it's not really very cold, but you and I are wearing a jacket. We are forced to because of what we've worn beneath this. But at the same time, I can see Salil, I can smell something in the air. So all the five senses are working simultaneously. Michel Serres believed that the idea of genre is very artificial. So if I say the word thriller, and you have the remote control in your hand, you can expect that your armpits and your palms will sweat at some point of time while watching the thriller. So the expectation has already been set. And true of the romance and so on. Similarly with the poem, we know that the poetic will be something very different from the kind of conversation you and I were having in the tent, while that too might be poetic. It was for me. So just as Jeet Thayil or me or any of us here, hi Jennifer, and at any given point of time, just as I'm living with all my senses, which are active, where one is not privileged over the other, where one cannot be privileged over the other, similarly moving through genres. So this comes to me most naturally, and I must say that I'm slightly bored by this idea of genre bending. It presumes that the genre exists and is something set in stone, while we know that we live very fluid lives, changing from moment to moment. The self is not a fixed thing. How can genres be?
After you wrote How I Became a Tree, you said that you often came across the question or the statement or the assumption that you wrote that book because you lived in the foothills of the Himalayas, and that you couldn't have written such a book if you hadn't lived in the foothills of the Himalayas, which of course immediately makes you think, well, not everybody who lives in the foothills of the Himalayas has written a book. I just wonder how annoying is a question like that?
It's a very annoying question. I've written about it in Provincials, as you know, and spoken about it very often. The expectation of someone who's supposed to have lived a life amidst quote-unquote nature, because I don't think I am separate from nature. You and I are nature too. So this expectation that just because I've lived at the foothills of the Himalayas, in the foothills of the Himalayas, will make me a certain kind of writer is perhaps justified. But whether it would provide me with the subject of my writing is an unfair expectation. So for me to expect that Jennifer, who's mostly from Bombay, though she has an ancestry in the provinces, she'll write what is now being called a Bombay book. I'm sure it's an irritating term or a category. Or someone living here would write a Bangalore book, is annoying, particularly because the focus is on subject matter. Does living in the provinces give my writing a form? Sure, it does. Just as being a woman, my husband doesn't answer the calling bell, I do. I tell the cook what to cook, and so on, attending caregiving responsibilities. So you see, the form in Provincials, or How I Became a Tree, has been forced on me, on my life as a woman. The section is my unit. The lyric is my form, not the epic, because I work in shorter attention spans that are allowed to me by my responsibilities, by various kinds of responsibilities. But no one is talking about these things. They expect it to be only about the subject, or as they say these days, content.
Going on from there, the connections that you make in this book between very kind of disparate subjects and writers is one of the delights of the book. Like, for example, you go from world-famous writers to obscure ones, from the text on an Archie's greeting card to letters to the editor in a newspaper, to song lyrics, to poets obscure and well-known, to the Bhakti movement, to a school friend, from Derrida to Tagore to the Brontes, to Heidegger, to Ramanujan, to Coetzee, to Raymond Williams. I'm guessing you would agree with E.M. Foster's construct that, he once said, only connect. Yeah.
Yes, I was just speaking with a friend about the only connect phrase, I think a couple of weeks ago. I think one of the delights, people call it research these days. It's a very grandiose term and something I don't do. I think all of us like to be butterflies. The mind is like that. They like to call it a monkey in studies of mindfulness, but I think it's more insect-like, moving from place to place. And just a little while ago in the tent, think of the range of subjects we covered. Yeah, and that, I think, what I write about, I might have woken up one day and thought about Jivanananda Das. My husband, who teaches critical theory, might have mentioned an anecdote about Derrida, and they will, be stored in my mind in some place. And my intention, I think, if intention is the right word for it, is to, if intention is permissible in such a way, is to allow these spaces a kind of neighborhood, a cohabitation, that academic writing, with its kind of sternness and strictness about compartments, about methodologies, and so on, do not necessarily allow. So just as the kind of conversation we had was freewheeling, I like to imagine that this genre will allow me to move from people to people, subject to subject in this way.
It's one of the great pleasures of this book, and I think it would bring pleasure to any reader, the exact butterfly quality that Sumana is just talking about.
Thank you.
I'd just like to bring up another thing that I found very delightful, actually, in this book. Your passage about how Indians, or the chapter about how Indians mispronounce words. Whereas most Indian writers in English would do this in a very condescending or comic way, you know. You take the side of those who mispronounce. For example, this chapter begins, "It's ask, not ax," someone says to you. The first time someone points out a word that's mispronounced, and you write, "I almost froze. It was as if someone had pointed out my bad breath, for that is the thing about grammar and pronunciation. They are the body odor and bad breath of socioeconomic class." There's something really moving. Yeah. Something moving about these passages. I mean, who among us hasn't mispronounced a word, especially in the days before Google taught you how to pronounce words? Mispronunciation, you say, is a provincial trait, but also an indication that the person guilty of mispronouncing is someone who lives in a non-English society but reads in English. And that is something very moving.
When we were walking to the tent, this is what we were discussing, Jeet. Just, I think a couple of weeks ago, my father, trying to explain why the stock market was crashing, said there were too many wars happening in the world right now. And he said, you know, I can't remember whether he said it was Russia or Ukraine. They've discovered new weapons. And I shared this with Jeet, as I did with a friend 2 weeks ago. And it made me smile, but it's also, as Jeet pointed out, being the poet he is, that he likes the sound of weapons because it has weep in it. So, so I think it's moving because it's so honest. I studied in a school where I was taught mostly by Nepali and Bengali teachers. I grew up in a small town called Shiliguri. And so my received pronunciation, as RP, as linguists like to call it, owes to that kind of background. So my pronunciation is a reservoir of my oral history, of what I have heard. So as I was telling Jeet, my grammar might be mostly correct, but correct me if I'm mispronouncing something. And he said, all of us are mispronouncing. And I think the history of our mispronunciation is also our history. And it's a beautiful one. Someone like me who might feel bullied, and I very often do. I teach in a university where my students often have to correct my pronunciation. I make a mistake between W-A-N-D-E-R and W-O-N-D-E-R. And one of my students, former students, who happens to be from Bangalore, made a joke about this mispronunciation while I was teaching them a poetry workshop. And at that moment, I might have felt slightly hurt. And I might have complained to a colleague of mine. But I think that is also part of my history. And it has taken me a long time to understand that I'm not ashamed of it. I accept its angularity.
In fact, there's a proud provincialism, if you want to call it that, in this book. And I wanted to ask two things about that before we move on. Is provincialism and cosmopolitanism are they necessarily opposed to each other? Can you be both cosmopolitan and provincial?
It's a question. Thank you, Jeet, for asking this question. It's a question that I've been asked often. And I think this is a false binary. And it has been set up to privilege one over the other. And we know which has been, we call just, I think 2 or 3 days ago, I was reading an essay by Bruce Robbins on the life, career, and health of the 20th century novel. And, my radar just kind of started beeping as soon as I saw his use of the word provincial. He was calling some part of America provincial or a habit provincial. And I think the whole point of writing this book was to show that provincials have been naturally cosmopolitan in places where I come from, whether it owes to our geography because of these various passes in the Himalayas, or in Kerala, in different places which are open to the sea. They have been naturally more cosmopolitan, which I understand in shorthand as open and welcoming of difference than perhaps landlocked regions such as the capital city of India has been. I think in that sense, Delhi is more provincial than a place like Darjeeling or Guwahati or Shillong.
Talking about Delhi, is there also an idea that provincialism is preferable to ethno-nationalism?
It's a very, I have to be careful while answering this because it's something, not because I'm scared, but because it's a subject, it's a thought that has occurred to me and my editor, particularly when I was writing this section on Heidegger, that what made him move towards fascism, this attachment to living in the Black Forest area. He wrote this very well-known, well-circulated essay, Why I Continue to Live in the Provinces. It was a radio talk just before the Second World War began, and how it could have lapsed into this kind of ethno-nationalism. It's something that I am scared of in myself as well. It's one I recognize. I understand that I'm a local patriot, not only in Siliguri, but in these places that I stay in or live in. And somehow, by the accidents of history, have taken me to places which have happened to be small towns. The place where I'm teaching in is very provincial, Sonipat. It's again an accident of history that I'm not teaching in a place in Delhi or in Calcutta. When I first traveled to Europe, I was living in a place for 9 months. If you see it as a Wikipedia entry, you will probably mispronounce it as Wroclaw. It's actually pronounced as Wrocław, a small town which belonged to Germany, but then after the Second World War and the moving of the border is now in Poland. And most of these places that I have lived in, even outside India or stayed in for small periods of time, have happened to be smaller towns, again, not by design. And I find that I become a local patriot at that particular point of time. And yes, I am aware that it might degenerate into an ethno-nationalist tendency.
One last question before we open it up in case somebody wants to ask anything. I see Provincials, this book, also as a story of formation, of a writer coming into her own. Because early in the book, you cite an instance where you took 2 lines from a Mother's Day card and added 2 lines of your own, and you write, not emotions, but the desire to write had performed had propelled me to perform what I would later discover was an act of intertextuality. And the four-line stanza is, not always eye to eye, but always heart to heart, not always hand in hand, but will never part. Is Provincials, in fact, a writer's coming-of-age story?
This, I think, is from the section on postcards. It's been a long time since I edited, so I've forgotten parts of the book. I think I was trying to align myself, maybe initially in a self-important way, thinking of myself as a writer, but also being able to see that the provincial first speaks in the form of the letter. So this is what Rabindranath, for instance, writing from the bank of the river Padma, began his writing career as a letter writer. He had written plays before that and poems, very interesting poems, but many, if we compare these letters that he was writing to his niece, Indira, with what would become the Golpo Guccio or the short stories, we find that he had found his idiom, his temper, his tone, his manner of seeing the world from this particular location, and this particular location had abetted and indulged this manner of expression. I was in a small town. I did not have the advantage of being in Shilai Daho or Padma. Limited by the circumstances of my life, all my mother encouraged me to do was to write letters to the editor, and which is what I did. And letters to the editor of this newspaper called The Telegraph, based in Calcutta. And the high of the publication, of seeing one's name in print, first came to me there. And I think even now, before the blogosphere kind of exploded in the first decade of this millennium or this century, I think this is where many of us first found our writing voice.
Shiliguri keeps coming up in your work, and it's clear to see that it shaped you and shaped your writing, and continues to shape you. What advice would you give your younger self today, and would you give a young writer who feels that they are on the periphery rather than in the center?
We're living through a moment in history, and I'm going to forgive this self-important tone, but I know that a book such as this one, I might have been able to write it, but it would not have been published. So we are living in a moment of publishing history that allows voices, stories, forms such as this alive in the world. And the distinction between the center and the periphery. And I say this in the book, Jeet, that I never thought I was a victim. I was never aware of being on the periphery. It's like, I think Adichie says that she didn't discover that she was black until she came to America. That kind of discovery, when that is your world, when that small town was everything to me, I had no understanding of center or periphery. And the internet has also, for good or for worse, dissolved that distinction. So it is possible for many of us to write from where we do without worrying about our location.
If we have time, I think, for one question, or yeah.
Hello. Hello. Yeah. Good morning, ma'am. It was a pleasure listening to you. So I like this part where you said that even our mispronunciations form a part of our history. So my question is, how important it is for us to embrace our mistakes along our journey, both in our life and also as a part of our career, be it writing or be it anything else for that matter.
I make a lot of mistakes. not just in my writing, but in my personal life. So I don't know whether we can embrace our mistakes. Our mistakes will really embrace us or find their way to us. I don't think we need to be. This seems like a pop philosophical question, kind of. I'm not the right person to answer this, but at some point of time, you'll, I suppose, use this American expression about owning up your mistakes. Isn't that what they owning your mistakes? Yes. So I think it's what makes us, and some mistakes might seem very important and urgent at that moment in time, but it all works out okay.
Thank you.
I want to say that when I when I sent a copy of this book to Jeet, we were having this conversation on email, and he said, so what are you going to, there, that's the bomb. So he said, so what are you going to send me? I said, I'm going to send you a bomb. And he said, okay, waiting for your bomb then. And this is the background sound to that.
And here we are. Anyway, thank you so much for this wonderful book and for talking to us. And thanks for being here.
Thank you, all of you, and thank you, Jeet.